So again, thanks everyone for coming here. So I'm Dr. Stacey Salinas. I teach at College of Redwoods. I'm the chair of ethnic studies at that division and department at CR, all the way in Eureka, so really, really far up north. It's about 5 hours from here. My main task in terms of research is making sure to preserve Filipina experiences during World War II, as well as Filipina experiences after the war, when they came to the United States, and majority of them married World War II Filipino veterans, and they worked actually as migrant farm workers alongside their husbands during the 19-teens going into the 1960s and 70s. And they also participated in the farm labor movement in Delano, as well as in Stockton, the San Joaquin Valley. So that's kind of the bulk of my research. But in particular for today, I'll just be speaking with you all about some of the talk stories or oral histories or kwentuhans that I did with our elders, the first generation folks, particularly the Manang generation. And Manang in Ilocano, Tagalog, means older sister or revered female elder. Okay, so before you can see kind of my makeshift interpretation of a bunch of newspaper scans like Fil-Am, Filipino American newspapers, as well as local and Washington, D.C. newspapers that kind of captured some of the narratives of Filipinas, Filipino women who participated in the war. And as we all know, because of gender norms and how society considers women's labor, usually women who participated physically in the war front as soldiers, as officers, we don't really see that narrative too often. Normally, they're relegated to medical assistants, right? Nurses, caretakers, folks who are more victims of sexual assault, genocide during World War II and earlier during the Pacific Theater. And so I wanted to make sure I was able to capture some of those newspapers that painted Filipina soldiers in a different light, right? And so we have here on the bottom corner a Filipina mestiza officer who served as a nurse and soldier alongside her African-American Philippine regiment husband right here. But again, when you read this article, she's only relegated to the role of nurse. In reality, she stood by her husband throughout the duration of the war, even taking up arms herself. And on the right-hand side, this is from the Philippines Mail. You have two Filipino officers who also served, rather than consistently being on the war front, right, physically on front lines. She used her radio skills and her communication skills to speak in code to folks, to the guerrilla resistance, as to when the next onslaught of the Japanese imperial forces were coming to a particular region or barrio or province in the Philippines. So why is it that Filipina labor in regards to their war efforts and war contributions are kind of hidden from us? We don't really see that in mainstream literature regarding Asian Pacific Islander women's roles during the Pacific Theater. Well, a lot of it has to do with gender frontiers or gender norms or gender social constructs, in the sense that women's roles are truly relegated to the house, to the domestic sphere. Anything beyond caregiving or the maternal kind of aura that she's supposed to produce and represent, anything beyond that isn't really visible because it goes against gender norms, especially in the Philippines during World War II and even prior. So you see before you one of the national Filipino heroes, Jose Rizal. He advocated for Philippine independence from Spain. Even in his works, which are highly revered in the Philippines, they're national works. Jose Rizal painted Filipinas as docile, demure, very feminine, very maternal. And so this is kind of the stereotypical image of Filipinas prior to the war and during the war, which is going to affect how Filipino guerrilla officers are going to be remembered after the war. So here you can see very demure, right? The lady in Mara Clara playing the harp. In artwork, the social construct of gender is very apparent, right? In how the Filipina is captured in both media, literature. So that's going to add to the blanket that's covering what Filipina soldiers were capable of doing during the war. And even during the war, as folks are trying to document what's happening, we have Fernando Amorsolo's paintings, very famous national Filipino artist during the war and after. The way that he also depicts women during the war really speaks more to victimization. As you can see here, 1942, the Falabataan here, 1942, the rape of Manila, and 1945. These are the most prominent pieces he has of women that he depicted during World War II. Defend Thy Honor, 1945. So it's really about victimization, women being used as tools in regards to human trafficking, rape, which are all very accurate and very true stories. But if this is the only image that is promoted and produced during the war and after in regards to women's contributions and experiences during the war, then more than likely, right, Filipino guerrillas, Filipino officers, Filipino soldiers, that narrative is going to be hidden. If you go to the Philippine National Art Museum, you can see this painting there in one of the exhibits for Amor Solo's paintings. But if we were to truly look at the archives, we can consider also the community narratives, the talk story, the oral history interviews, and digging in community archives where I found the Philippines Mail, for example, on the Central Coast. We can see, if we do all of that digging and speak to community members who actually lived through World War II, that Filipinas, as guerrillas, as resistance fighters, they were many things. Yes, it is true that many of them were victims. Many of them did suffer at the hands of human trafficking, comfort women status. But there are also other ways in which they contribute to the war. Their experiences are also much more complex. And those include, they served as mothers, martyrs, spies, wives, nurses, doctors, caregivers, nationalists, revolutionaries, peasants, communists, soldiers, teachers, colonels, commanders, socialists, journalists, sisters, war brides after the war, actresses. They were sex workers, sex slaves, also known as comfort women, but above all, them simply surviving that experience makes them heroes in their own right. Because to survive is an act of resistance. So if you look at the screen before all of you, these are all the different kinds of examples that Filipinos contributed to the war effort. But, you know, a lot of the women who survived the war, a lot of the Filipinas who survived the war, of course, because it was such a traumatic series of events, it was very difficult for them to kind of narrate that experience to other folks, especially for the women who were forced to serve as comfort women, as sex slaves. To speak about your sexual assault, your experience with rape, was also taboo, and it still is taboo in many Asian communities, both domestically here in the States as well as abroad. And a lot of women, because of how society reared them in regards to being a wife, first and foremost, a mother, first and foremost, you know, prioritizing their experience and their narrative, their life narrative as a homemaker, that took priority. And so for a lot of the Filipina elders, the Manang generation that I had the privilege and the honor to interview and speak with and speak alongside. Really, I wasn't there at first to listen to their stories about the war. I was actually there initially for my initial topic of research, which was to document the farm labor movement on the Central Coast. But as time went on and I got to know the lolas, the grandmothers, the aunties, and their daughters and their grandchildren, it's over time, of course, you build that relationship of trust, and they were able to open up to me about their experiences during the war. And so one of those beautiful grandmothers, lolas, who passed away in 2021, towards the tail end of the pandemic, Grandma Sherry, her original name was Sarapia, but when she got married to her World War II veteran husband, she took on his name, which was Arimas. So she also changed her name so it's more Americanized. So it was easier to write her name when they were filling out their documents for marriage, as well as immigration to the US. So she changed her name to Sherry. So Grandma Sherry, or Lola Sherry, is depicted here. She served as a guerrilla officer on the island of Samar, which is a really, 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 really small island. It's not part of the main island in the Philippines. And what she was able to tell with me, because again, initially I was only there to interview her about the farm labor movement and her experiences living in the migrant farm camps. She had asked me if my grandmother was also from the Philippines, if she was born there as well. And it's in that kind of relationship and that kind of mutual bond of the motherland that she opened up to me about her war experiences. And she explained to me that when the bells started ringing on her college campus in Samar, that it was about 12 hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor. She told me that the bells meant that you need to go home immediately. So drop everything you're doing, you need to go home. And so she was still on the island of Samar, and some folks who were kind of rallying people to be part of this newfound resistance, they had asked her, well, you know, a lot of the Imperial Japanese officers are not going to see Filipinas women as capable of spy work. They don't think you're capable of doing manual labor that requires, you know, being a soldier. And so they really did look to Filipinas as a potential spy unit. And so that was the service that she provided for her local resistance unit. So she would, you know, carry what they would call propaganda items or just even small notes and then share them with folks to let them know where the Imperial Japanese officers were located on the island of Samar. But of course, you know, over time, as more Japanese officers were coming to the island of Samar, she did go into hiding, but she continued to participate in the war effort. And so she told me about this one kind of instance where they had communication on the island of Samar. So you would cut down bamboo trees, you would have one long bamboo stalk, and you would make sure to cut it so that when you hit it, it would echo a particular way. And so they would line up the bamboo posts down the road that's shared by all the community members in that barrio or province. And so when they heard that a Japanese officer or a unit was on the way, they would actually knock a certain way on those bamboo posts. And that's how they were able to carry down the long, long, long road through that barrio, letting other folks know down the line that folks were coming. So that also counts as, you know, working in regards to joining the resistance efforts, right? That's labor. But again, she did not prioritize or see that her story was important because, again, she prioritized what society expected of her, which was to serve as a homemaker for her family. But nonetheless, she was very sassy, and she was determined to, when she came to the United States, to bring all of her knowledge with her, to be a jack of all trades for her husband. So what she did was immediately after the war, and she told her husband she's going to go to college whether he likes it or not, which he fully supported. She was the first to graduate from the Manila Fashion School immediately after the war. And she took all of her skills that she learned during the war as well as in college. She brought with her to the city of Salinas, which is one of the major farming community towns on the Central Coast in Monterey. And she didn't share with anyone about her experience of being a guerrilla until I knocked on her door and she shared that narrative with me. So this is actually the contract she signed acknowledging that she was part of the Philippine resistance in that particular locality in Samar. And underneath it, she was able to save this paper and she stuck it in a sticky album. Underneath it, she was so proud of that moment, she put her marriage certificate picture as well on the bottom so she could always remember not only her contributions to the war, but also that it was a moment where she was able to gain a lot of things in the sense that she fell in love with someone, right? She was able to marry them within, I think, if I remember what Lola said, like less than 3 months. And not only that, she has her contract here showcasing that, yes, she did participate in the war, but she also gained something positive out of it. She found the love of her life. So I remember, too, after we would have lunch or merienda, snacks, she took me to this one aisle in her house downstairs in the salas in the living room, and she showed me all of the pictures of her and her husband right after the war. And when they came to the United States, she arrived by ship. And she would constantly say, like, isn't my husband handsome in his uniform? She was constantly doing it. Look at my husband, anak, which means dear child. Look at my husband, he's so handsome. And I would say, Grandma, yes, he is very handsome, but you're beautiful too. Do you have any pictures of you during the war? I would love to see that as well. And then it, you know, in a way, it dawned on her. She didn't think that her experience was good enough to capture. And so a lot of the Filipina survivors of World War II who participated in the guerrilla resistance or who were aware of the guerrilla resistance units in their barrio or province, again, they didn't think that their experiences were of note, something of note. She always reminded me that during the war, it was her husband who was the real hero, right? So seeing her narrative as second in comparison to others. And of course, it was difficult to kind of paint the landscape of World War II in the Philippines because it was different across different barrios, across different provinces. So as I was interviewing Filipinas who had married World War II veterans, they came to the States in the late 40s and 50s. Again, I was only there to really talk to them about their experience with the farm labor movement during the 60s and 70s with the UFW. But some of the Filipinas were children during the war or teenagers, so they didn't necessarily serve as guerrillas, but they were aware and they had had experiences in regards to confrontations with the guerrillas and the Japanese imperial forces. And one of those wonderful grandmas who also unfortunately passed away recently in 2023, Grandma Babes, or she liked to be called Grandma Baby, who's depicted here, also from the island of Samar. It was because of her experiences and how she painted the landscape of Samar as a teenager and how she saw guerrilla soldiers being carted off by Imperial Japanese officers, that I was able to, in a way, describe a narrative in the beginning of my book and the beginning of my research that really shows how desperate the resistance movement was in the Philippines. So not only I'm so grateful for the Filipino resistance fighters like narratives like Grandma Sherry, but I'm also extremely grateful that I had other elders who could paint for me, at least in my mind's eye, what the landscape looked like for those Filipinas to serve in. And another Filipina I just want to make sure I highlight who also passed away, Lourdes Poblete. She was part of the Live or Die unit. She received her Valor of Honor, I believe, during the last year of Obama's presidency when they were honoring all the resistance fighters who participated in the war who were living in the United States, including Hawaii. I was able to interview her in 2017, 2018. She lived at the International Hotel in San Francisco, if folks are familiar with that historic space. And she was actually interned at Santo Tomas. So she was caught as a guerrilla by Japanese officers. Her father had just survived the Bataan Death March. Her father also was forced to sign a contract, which a lot of folks had to do if they wanted to leave the internment camps, saying that they acknowledged Japanese presence in the Philippines because he was so desperate to get home to his family. He had, if I remember correctly, 6 or 7 children. But upon arrival, he did not know that his daughter, Grandma Lourdes, had signed on to be part of the resistance, where she also delivered propaganda to folks. She worked in a Japanese fortification where they would, move supplies from one space to another. He did not know that his daughter was part of the resistance. And so one night, Grandma Lourdes was telling me the story that the Japanese officer had come to their door, knocked on their door, and they demanded that she go with them. And they said she'll only be gone for one night. And Grandma Lourdes said one night turned into 2 years. And she was interned at Santo Tomas with another woman that she called Nati, which was short for Natividad. And when they started bombing Manila, she and Nati saw that as an opportunity to try and escape. So they did try to escape. They hid in one of the Ayala mansions in Manila. And when the coast was clear, they parted ways and they walked their separate ways. I forget exactly which town that Grandma Lourdes was from, but at least 20 miles on foot, both of them. And she told me that her biggest regret after the war was that she was never able to reconnect with Natividad, Nati. But her story speaks to, other moments of the guerrilla female resistance in the sense that what did internment look like as a POW, as a resistance fighter, as a woman? Because her story was uniquely different in the sense that many of the Filipino guerrillas who were captured, yes, they were raped, they were murdered, and their bodies were tossed in unmarked graves. Grandma Lourdes said that she was fortunate in the sense that the Japanese officers stationed at Santo Tomas actually respected the women in that space. And so they had told all the other Japanese officers, you are not allowed to touch them. And the Filipina guerrilla fighters who were stationed at Santo Tomas, they were assigned the role of clearing out and cleaning the prisons, as well as preparing food if there was any. So again, she told me that she was very fortunate that there were Japanese officers who essentially said you cannot touch Filipinas or the other women in this space. And later on, immediately after the war, she was part of the war tribunal. She was one of the folks who was giving their testimonies. And the Japanese officer who had declared that you cannot touch any of the Filipina folks who are imprisoned here at Santo Tomas, she actually had to give her testimony explaining that that gentleman was complicit in war crimes at Santo Tomas. But again, many of these Filipinas, I'm very fortunate, they immigrated to the United States. Some in 1946, others in the 1950s. So Grandma Lourdes, Grandma Sherry, Grandma Babes, they all came to the States around the 50s and 60s, and they participated, many of them, in the farm labor movement. Grandma Lourdes especially, she actually served as a nurse in San Francisco until she retired in, I believe, the 80s. So how are Filipinas remembered or depicted? Beyond, of course, the narrative of victim of comfort women. So usually it's in a state of destitution. And Filipinos are constantly trying to take care of the home, provide for their families. This is a photograph from the National Archives of the commissary, where many Filipinos would try to go to receive resources, basic essentials to provide for their family immediately after the war. So these are common images that we see associated with the Filipino experience. Providing for their family, right? In other cases, Filipinos are serving as nurses, caregivers. But again, none of those two images that I showed you really speaks to their soldierly efforts during the war. And here's one of the more famous American films that came out, I believe, 3 to 5 years after the war, American Guerrilla in the Philippines. The Filipinas who are in this movie, Filipinas and Filipinos who are in this movie, they don't have any credits. Their names are not in the credits, unfortunately. But again, here we can see that if there were Filipinos present in the war, how they're historically remembered is truly as nurses, caregivers, victims. But folks like Carmen Rosales, Pasita Totod's here, Carmen Rosales is here, they contribute to the war effort. Carmen Rosales is actually a very famous Filipina actress during the war. The Japanese officers wanted her to produce propaganda films. She actively refused, but she also served as a guerrilla officer, keeping a gun on her at all times. And after the war, she actually made a film depicting some of her experiences. But of course, folks wouldn't take it seriously that a Filipina was indeed a resistance fighter, let alone a guerrillera. And so there had to be a romantic element to it. And Pasita Totod is actually 1.5 generation in the sense that she came to the United States and she grew up majority in the States, so 1.5 generation. She was responsible for the Philippine American regiments, Philippine Regiment 1 and 2, because initially during the 1940s, the US would not allow Filipino officers, immigrant officers who were working as migrant farmers, they would not allow them to naturalize and become citizens. She argued and wrote to local military leaders in California, you must allow Filipinos to defend their motherland. You must grant them citizenship because they're going to risk their lives for USAFE, United States Armed Forces of the Far East. That's the least you can do. And because of her letter, she was able to get Filipino immigrant folks who are migrant farm workers in California in particular, and Washington and Oregon, the Pacific Northwest and Hawaii. They were able to get citizenship by their services because of Pasita Totod, who also was a film actress during the 30s and 40s. So how are Filipinas remembered as guerrilla fighters in literature? It's very, very few and far in between. One of the more famous pieces of literature that depict the guerrilla movement, guerrilla resistance, is this one here. It's really about, his unit was called the Markings because it was named after himself. His wife at the time, Ye Panalilio, she was a Filipino-American journalist. She went to the Philippines to do journalism and radio right before the war. She met him while she was escaping Japanese invasion of Manila. And she met him in the barrio where she joined the resistance. But really, her initial writing about him was really more to highlight his efforts as the leader of the marking guerrilla unit. Over time, though, she of course added her own contributions as a Filipino resistance fighter, that she served as a colonel, so Colonel Liay Panlilio. But prior to that, she really had only highlighted his efforts as a resistance fighter and leader. And even when we look at local newspapers, Filipino-American newspapers during the war, when we read the literature on what's being covered in terms of how far the resistance units are succeeding in the Philippines, this is just one poem by a Phil-Am farm worker in Salinas. If you were to consider this really short poem, he's really only seeing resistance fighters or guerrillas as men. There's no mention of women resistance fighters at all. So it says here on the last line, we are the men who fought and waited long, for we believe that freedom must be strong. And in regards to how we have monuments that memorialize the experiences and efforts of Filipinas who participated in the war, who survived the war, if folks haven't seen this before, this is one of the landmark stands and statues dedicated to Filipinas who were forced to serve as comfort women in the Philippines. So this is on one of the main roads on the way to, oh my God, I'm already forgetting. the major historic area where they bombed St. Augustine. If you're on your way to St. Augustine, this is the main road, and you'd overlook the harbor or the port, you would see the statue. But under President Duterte, who was trying to build relationships with Japan in the late 2010s, forgive me, he said, place it somewhere else. We don't want to insult Japanese diplomats who are coming to the Philippines to help us build our train system, our railroad system, our bullet train system. We don't want to insult them. Place that statue somewhere else. It's unsightly. And they did. So within less than 4 months, they took down this statue on one of the main streets in Manila. And the original artist had it on hand. Within, I want to say, less than a year, it had gone missing. Someone had vandalized and had taken the statue. So we no longer have this, memorial piece of evidence to showcase that, yes, the Philippines does indeed care about their lolas who survived the war as comfort women. So that's also absent in Philippine literature and Philippine narrative, unfortunately. What they did replace it with was rather lackluster, which is this little memorial guard. But you really have to try and find it. It's in front of one of the other major churches, but it's just one. And so, of course, Filipinas, whose mothers were resistance fighters, whose mothers and grandmothers were comfort women, they took it upon themselves by way of a grassroots initiative to make a statue for them, with or without the consent of the Philippine government. So in total, when we consider the collective memory of Filipinas as participants, folks who are experiencing total war, again, they're mainly depicted as victims and casualties, not as veterans, and definitely not as resistance fighters. Okay. So again, what was the arduous task set before me and my colleagues in terms of trying to find these women's experiences? Well, of course, we have to dig through the archives, which you need funding for, and you need time dedicated to it. I was a full-time grad student, and I was working full-time, because that's how you make ends meet, unfortunately, in grad school. So I was able to work during the summers to do this research for PAE. And I'm just going to show you some of the things that I was able to find. So you did have Filipinas who were present during the Bataan Death March. They served as nurses and doctors. So these two files here that you see before you, this is the list of Filipinas who served as nurses during the Bataan Death March and prior at Corregidor. But also, many of these women, after surviving the march, they would go into hiding, and they themselves became part of the guerrilla resistance movement, and they served as the healers and caretakers of the guerrillas, particularly in the mountainside, in the north and in Luzon. And it was because one American nurse recognized that Filipinas were not being recognized for their contributions to the war effort. So she actually, I forget the name of the nurse who wrote this, the head nurse, but she's the one who provided the list because she wanted her Filipino sisters to be recognized in the war. And in terms of literature and historiography, I had to read between the lines because, again, the mention of Filipinas was very few, far in between. One of those that caught my eye was Wendell Fertig's experience as a guerrilla leader. He does mention one or two Filipinas, but he only mentions one by name. And the way that he describes her, it's very misogynistic, of course, because he is a product of his time. He describes how beautiful she is. He's not really taking seriously her contributions to the war effort. And I think I have her image here. So this is Capistrano. She served with or alongside Wendell Fertig. After the war, she demanded that Filipinas not only be given medals of honor for what they contributed, but also allow women to have their own auxiliary unit as part of the Philippine national military. So she continued to serve her people and her sisters, even after the war. But again, the way that Wendell Fertig describes her in his work, really just as a beauty to behold, didn't really take her seriously in regards to her fighting and her contributions as a guerrilla. So I really had to read between the lines. And of course, Colonel Yai Panlilio. her autobiography and her experiences as a Filipina-American guerrilla. Over time, I believe in like 10 to 15 years, they're going to make a Filipino movie about her experiences. But because, again, society could not conceive of Filipinas of being physical warriors, guerrillas or guerrilleras, they had to add, again, another romantic influence or aesthetic to the film. So really highlighting the romance rather than what she did as a colonel for the marking guerrilla unit. And other experiences of folks, these books are few and far in between. Enduring What Cannot Be Endured by Dorothy Dowland. Her experiences as a teenager throughout the war. And if you read her book, she's able to paint the landscape as to how desperate the situation was for guerrillas and how local civilians tried their best to take in these guerrilla units. And of course, Maria Rosa Henson, one of the more famous female interpretations of World War II. She served as a guerrilla, but she was captured first, and she was forced to serve as a comfort woman. And in her experience, she was able to overhear some of the Japanese officers explain to one another where they plan on moving their unit to next. And so the comfort women, particularly where she was stationed, they were kind of covered or surrounded by barbed wire and fences, but it still allowed you to be able to speak to civilians if they came across your path on the other side of that fence. Because of her, she was able to warn civilians on the other side that they need to leave their barrio because the Japanese were coming. And so from my perspective as a historian, I would argue, yes, that was part of her role as a guerrilla. Even though she was in prison and she was being sexually assaulted on a daily basis, she still had it within her to serve as a guerrilla and to let civilians know, her people know, that they need to keep moving. And this one actually just came out. So I encourage folks to purchase it on Amazon if you can. So this is by Elizabeth Ann Bessa Carino. Her mother, similar to the Lolas, the grandmothers that I had the wonderful opportunity to interview, she never spoke about her war experience. Her mother was a great cook. She loved to use her leisure time to cook up Filipino recipes and culinary traditions. And so if you ever have an opportunity to purchase this book and read this book, a lot of the experiences that her daughter was able to document about her mother's experience during the war and thereafter, it's always associated with one kind of Filipino recipe. So it's a really great narrative to consider when we're looking at Filipino resistance during the war. And of course, the most important that added to this entire book and the second edition, it really was the most dependent on community narratives. In Tagalog, we call speaking with our elders, talk story, or kwentuhan. And so that's what I did for, I want to say, 3 to 5 years. I'm still doing it with the grandchildren and the children of the Manong and the Manong generation. It's from their experiences during the war that I was able to really, really, really capture the roles that Filipinas contributed to, and why it's important that we should memorialize those efforts because it's not visible in other academic institutional spaces. So here are just some of the photographs I was able to collect. Grandma Sherry would actually help. She's right here at the age of 98, when she was still with us. She was a lifetime member of the Filipino Women's Club of Salinas, which is the oldest Filipina-American organization, grassroots organization in the country. And she was with them until she passed away in 2021. And that is my presentation for y'all. Thank you so much for hanging out and listening in. And I'll take any questions if you all have any. Thank you. Yes?
Based on your research, was anything held back from you from Executive Order 89/1985 on anything relating to the OSS operations or Japanese incursions and depredations in Manila and the Philippines and their occupation? Was anything held back?
In terms of being held back, as in I couldn't access them?
That you weren't able to access, yes.
No, but at the time, things were more readily available prior to the pandemic when I started the bulk of my research. It was during the pandemic where it was a little bit more difficult to get access and to call folks to see if I could get access to particular archives. But again, I primarily relied on the local Philam communities in California for their experiences. But when it came to the actual documentation of like military items, that I relied on the National Archives, so the Library of Congress, because during the pandemic, as many folks know, because we were under lockdown, the archivists did something incredibly brave and courageous, was that they were digitizing everything. Everything. So in real time, as they were digitizing all those things and making it available to the public, I was able to capture some of that new information and add it, which is why I thought it was imperative that I make a second edition.
The reason I asked
Yes.
that, because when I was doing some research in Laos and Cambodia for a number of generals that were working with the American military, a lot of the information I found was redacted.
Oh, I see. Interesting.
Like the whole paragraph on such and such blank. Would this happen?
Yes.
Blank. Whole sections of things were
Sure.
redacted that I
So clearly a national agenda in some way, yes. Unfortunately, I did not have that experience when I was doing my research prior to the pandemic.
Thank you.
Yes, of course. Thank you for your question. Yes.
When you speak to survivors or
Yes.
their family members for documentation,
Yes.
what are the key questions that you always include?
Oh, my breakout session actually includes how I conduct kwentuhan, because it's a Filipino cultural tradition, so I can show folks that during my breakout session. But in reality, it's more about, because in the field of history, it's very extractive. It's a very Western interpretation of how to record and preserve folks' narratives. And so in ethnic studies, in cultural studies, in gender studies, we truly care about the person in whom we're engaging with. And so I made sure that the questions that I had asked were not extractive in the least. And it's about consistently and constantly building a relationship with the communities and individuals that we interview, because in many ways we are taking stories from them. And so over time, it really was just fluid. So she wanted me to treat her, lucky for me, I'm Filipina, and so she saw me as another granddaughter. So that was an opening for me to be able to build some foundation of trust. And she really just treated me as a granddaughter. So I would just ask her as we were having merienda, or she'd slice me fruit, because Asian grandparents were that cool, right? So she would serve me like coffee and tea and sliced fruit, and it would just be organic. Really like, oh, Lola, how's your day today? What are you doing? She'd tell me how she's watching the Oscars right now, right? Or there's another one where she called it the war bride visa or something, the lover's visa. She'd be watching something like that on TLC. And then so she would just be talking to me about it rather organically. So lucky for me, as a community member, she saw kapwa, which is myself and others. She saw that in me, so I was able to build a fluid kind of conversation with her each day at a time. But I do have the questions lined up if folks are interested on how to conduct Talk Story. Thank you. Yes?
First of all, I would ask people in the room to stop talking to each other or leave the room if you want to have a conversation. We're trying to listen to the room that's talking. The second thing is, I'm having a little bit of trouble hearing you. I think I heard you say that the United States bombed Manila. Was there any criticisms of the way that the United States liberated Manila?
Yes, because it really was truly scouted in the sense that they were trying to scour the entire terrain to kind of rat out and push out Japanese forces that were maybe in hiding, but of course to the detriment of whom? The civilians, right? So they suffered the most. So in my second edition of the Philippine Guerrillas, the Pinay Guerrilleras, I mentioned how Grandma Lourdes, who used to live at the I Hotel before she passed on, she explained that it was just too much bombing. And it wasn't just located in Manila, it was everywhere. And so when she was finally able to escape Santo Tomas and find her family, they had told her the bombing is coming, so you must go into hiding. And so many folks assumed, because the American military was not telling civilians where to go to hide as they were bombing, they thought that the cemetery was probably the safest place to be. But the American military thought definitely folks are going to be hiding there. So she actually lost one of her siblings as they were trying to hide in the cemetery due to friendly fire. Of course. Any other questions? Yes?
So you talked about how your grandmother was kind of surprised when you were asking about her role in the war and her experience, because there was all this focus on her husband. What were some of the experiences of other people that you talked about? Because this might have been the first time someone took an interest in their experience.
What were other folks saying about? Well, her daughter, when you do kwentuhan in the Filipino cultural tradition, you want to make sure there's an intergenerational experience being had so that we can all share our narratives, from your daughter to your granddaughter to your nieces. And so it was also the first time that her daughter was able to hear about her experiences on the island of Samar. And they were pretty intense. So there was like one example where one of the guerrilla couples, so one of the locals, man and woman, they were found out by the local Japanese station there, and they had actually dug out a pit, and they put them in there and buried them alive. So she had witnessed these things and heard them through the grapevine as well, of regular atrocities being committed on Samar. And so her daughter was able to hear that for the first time as well. So that really added to their collective experience that they could share together about what it was like to live in the Philippines during World War II. But if anything, what Grandma Lourdes loved to talk about was how she met her husband at the commissary, because she served the Red Cross immediately after the war, and it was him giving her parcels, basic essentials. You're not supposed to give those away, right? But he gave it to her in passing and would smile at her and nod, and she said that she just loved to talk about that, because she was just so much in love 70 plus years later with him still, even though he had passed on. And so having that experience with her daughter and her, it just made the interview less of an interview and more of we were just having a family party together. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah,
Okay.
thank you.
Yes. And then you had your hand up first.
Oh, yeah, so the women that were, that you said that they would have like maybe a reintegration into families or into groups that went from being guerrillas as either in a squadron, a troop, or a battalion, or, you know, some like larger group, but then if they need to be recognized or cared for and have a medic, is that the thing about women that falling under a stigmata or taboo, is that it's never ending, or does it end, or was it just like a reintegration and the care of coming to U.S. coming to you, or you coming to the U.S. for the farm movement? So what do you think about the end of taboo?
Well, these women, when they were still with us, they still kind of carried that stigma around them as to what women can and can't say, what is appropriately feminine and what is not appropriately feminine. So that was something I had to work on in terms of deconstructing and breaking down with the grandmas and the lolas and the aunties. But upon arriving to the United States, a lot of them, again, they did not see their merit as guerrilla resistance fighters. And so when it came time, it was the last year of Obama's term, when they were essentially saying, we will give you your recognition, your Medal of Honor, you just have to give us solid evidence that you had served in the war effort, whether through testimony or through paper documentation. And Grandma Sherry didn't do that because, again, she didn't think it was important. Whereas Grandma Lourdes, right, who was intern at Santo Tomas, she was already in San Francisco. And so she believed that, no, you know, it's time for me to be recognized, and so I'm going to do that. And so she submitted her paperwork, and she was able to receive her medal. The other horrible thing that had prevented many Filipinos to be able to have recognition and also receive a medal, or even veterans benefits, immediately after the war, you have the United States president at the time, Truman, who redacts or rescinds the veterans benefits for Filipino resistance fighters. And his argument was, because they had initially promised Filipino resistance fighters and Filipinos who served in USAFI, you can get veterans benefits and you can come to the States, you can be a naturalized citizen. Instead, he changes his mind right after the war because he doesn't want to waste millions of dollars on brown soldiers. And he doesn't want to grant them citizenship because the US is still extremely living through the Jim Crow era. And so he denies hundreds of thousands of folks veterans benefits. And by the time we reach 2016, forgive me, 2015, when these women are being recognized, many of them had passed away already. So very, very few and far in between. And so those are the things that had kind of led up to, you know, not just taboo, but there's other barriers that kind of force them to not be able to speak to their experiences. I hope that helped. Okay, and then over here. Sorry.
Has the Japanese government ever acknowledged the atrocities that they conducted in the Philippines?
I think I was doing research on it the other month. They do recognize the experience of, or at least some semblance of comfort women, of sex slaves, but not to the totality in the sense that they don't recognize the numbers. They don't want to acknowledge that it was more than 200,000 maybe women, right? Or I think some of the estimates are as low as like 5,000, right? But they're all throughout East, Southeast Asia, and South Asia. Right, and so that's not being recognized, the actual totality of the comfort woman situation and experience. When it comes to like the other atrocities, so mass rape, murder, the mass burning of barrios and provinces, it's still kind of up in the air because, of course, currently, as we all probably know from international news platforms, the Philippines is still trying to work with Japan in terms of building their own railways, transportation systems. So they're very much reliant on that kind of engineering and technology. So if you have that kind of diplomatic relationship in terms of financial investment, you're not going to want to bring up past harm, despite the fact that this harm and trauma, it still has a legacy and impact today. So I hope that answers your question.
You mentioned 200,000?
Some folks are estimating that many, but I think I have this slide actually. Let me just pull it up really quick. Give me one moment. There you go. 50,000 to 200,000. Thanks for reminding me it was up there. Anyone else? Yes?
So, when you were talking with them about their experiences, did they ever talk about the cultural norms that maybe they leaned on for when they led or when they inspired others around them? Not just like the experiences they had, but like, you know, culturally how it was different for them versus like how we think of things like leadership or
Sure.
inspiration.
Right. So for Filipinas, right, there's this kind of sisterhood or Pinay sisterhood. So if you read Colonel Yai Panlilio's autobiography, which she titles The Crucible, she notes all of the Filipina resistance fighters and even the Filipina civilians who were just there nursing folks as they were trying to escape the Japanese officers or guerrilla units that were trying to go into hiding. She notes all of their names that she could remember when she was writing it. So I do recommend that resource because she really explains that it wasn't just the men who were present as resistance fighters. She actually showcases in particular moments of her narrative how the male guerrilla officers did not take seriously any of the Filipino resistance fighters. They saw them as too domineering, too outspoken, and they thought that they were just trying to get into relationships with the higher ups. So she mentions all of those kinds of nasty misogynist things in her book if you wanted to purchase that. I believe you can get a digital copy as well on Amazon. Yes, I hope that helps. Okay. Anyone else? Okay, I truly appreciate all your questions. Thank you so much. I have a breakout session at 2 or 3 p.m. if you want to learn more about Talk Story, how to do oral history interviews in order to preserve your family's narratives about the war or any particular historic moment you want to capture with your family members. So I'll be there downstairs at 2 or 3 p.m. But thank you very much for having me. I hope you all have a good rest of your day. Thank you.